Okay, welcome everybody. Welcome to the workshop Final Briefings. This is in fact the culminating element of our curriculum and really the culminating event of the year. This is where we take all of the knowledge that we've learned from environmental chemistry and toxicology over the summer to environmental ethics, to financial management and everything in between, and apply it to problem solving. And so at this point, our class is a group of problem-solving sustainability professionals, as we'll see 5 examples of this work today. We do this work as a public service. We contribute our effort to making the world a better place. And the workshop is really one of the most important elements of our curriculum. We prepare you for this exercise with clients by spending an entire 2 semesters working on simulation. And I think the results, as you'll see today, are quite impressive. This has been an incredible learning experience for everybody in a very tough environment. First time we've done this kind of work without actually being together in the same room. Certainly when we started last year, we never thought we would continue to do this in the way we're doing it. But just the same, the work is spectacular, and we'll begin with our first project, which Colleen Neely will present, advised by Professor Eileen McGinnis, on advancing racial justice. So Colleen, if you're ready, take it away.
Okay, great, thank you. Good morning, my name is Colleen Neely, and today I have the privilege to speak with you about our work with the NAACP focused on advancing racial justice in federal flood policy. This plaque was unveiled in New Orleans in 2015, honoring the 3,400 families of the lower Ninth Ward who were disproportionately exposed to the relentless waters of the Mississippi River when a levee surrounding the community was breached during Hurricane Katrina. The lower Ninth Ward is a predominantly Black community where nearly 40% of families live on less than $15,000 a year. While narrative originally attributed the storm strength to the breach, later investigations actually showed that it was a combination of Army Corps cost-cutting measures and miscommunication of risk that led to insufficient and negligent levee design. In fact, the federal judge presiding over related lawsuits said in his ruling, "One central theme that has been painfully obvious is that many of the levees protecting New Orleans were tragically flawed. But despite this incredible acknowledgement, most communities never saw justice because of laws that give immunity to the Army Corps, no matter how negligent." And while nearly all of New Orleans flooded during Katrina, 80% of people in flooded areas were Black, surfacing the disproportionate impact flooding has on communities of color. And disparities are present across the United States, not just in New Orleans. A study found that when communities experience natural disasters, white individuals accumulate $75,000 in wealth, whereas Black individuals lose $50,000 in wealth. And this underscores one of the starkest racial disparities in the United States: the profound gap in post-disaster outcomes between white and Black communities as a result of uneven access to federal aid, favoring those with more resources and higher property values. Our work and the mission of our capstone client, the NAACP, the oldest racial justice organization in the US with over 2,000 chapters, rests at this juncture. Through their environmental and climate justice program, the NAACP works to empower communities in advocating for climate justice and to hold institutions like the Army Corps accountable for upholding civil and human rights. And with this focus, the NAACP asks us to make recommendations for advancing racial justice in federal flood policy focused on the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And over the next 3 slides, we will review the Army Corps' role in flood management. The Army Corps plays a major role in the selection, design, and construction of major flood infrastructure across the US, like the 13,000 miles of levees you see in pink, as well as dams and nature-based infrastructure like wetlands. And at the center of the Corps' project selection process is the benefit cost analysis, or BCA. And simply put, when economic, social, and environmental benefits that a community may experience from flood protection exceeds project costs, project approval is more likely. But however, and problematically, economic considerations have historically dominated because they're easily quantified. But in not fully considering the social and environmental benefits a community may experience from added structural resilience, projects in low wealth, low property value, and communities of color are systematically deprioritized. But the BCA is not the only barrier. Army Corps flood infrastructure projects require the local community to cost share in the project, which can amount to millions of dollars, pricing out low wealth communities with small tax bases. Learning about the barriers within Army Corps policies established a starting point for our work. But to more deeply understand the impact on communities, we developed, in collaboration with the NAACP, a series of guiding questions which we will discuss next. Our questions begin foundationally. How does the Army Corps' project development process work, and does it result in racial disparities? And how are communities impacted by the processes and procedures? Then, how can the Army Corps better protect communities of color and advance racial justice? And how can the NAACP use our findings to promote their climate and racial justice goals? So now I'm excited to move us into our key findings, which were, first, that data shows disparity. Second, that community advocacy works. And third, that the Army Corps does recognize that disparity exists. Using census and flood exposure data, we conducted mapping and analysis exercises to identify relationships between socioeconomic variables and flood exposure. This is one of the maps we created showing the percent of properties at risk of flooding within the greater St. Louis area. Focusing east of the Mississippi River, we see Centerville, Illinois. This community is 95% Black with nearly a 50% poverty rate and a median property value of $53,000, and experiences some of the highest rates of flood exposure in the region, with nearly 40% of properties at risk of flooding. These community characteristics are the result of historic racist redlining practices, as well as disparities stemming from Army Corps local cost sharing requirements for projects. In 2009, the community was found to need significant flood infrastructure upgrades, but because they could not afford the cost share, they were made to wait 10 years until they could. Meanwhile, the community experienced significant sewage overflow events due to the inundation of floodwaters. And this is harmful not only to the environment, but also to human health and dignity, and highlights disparities that can result from community cost share requirements. Our second finding is that community advocacy works. For nearly a decade, the Army Corps has been involved in a controversial project off the coast of Texas that threatens the local ecology and economy of the region. Bayou City Waterkeeper, an environmental advocacy group in Greater Houston, has been on the front lines pushing the Corps for more socially and environmentally holistic designs. Through the Freedom of Information Act, Bayou City obtained files showing the exact locations of Corps proposed infrastructure, as you see here. And this was really pivotal because it showed, in a way not previously disclosed, the homes and businesses that would be impacted or displaced through eminent domain. In addition to this, Bayou City educated coastal communities on alternatives to this traditional hard infrastructure, things such as oyster reefs, wetlands, and expanding land conservation along the coast. And these efforts ultimately helped to mobilize massive numbers to engage the Corps and make clear their desire for greater use of nature-based infrastructure, which did result in the Corps reconsidering elements of their proposed project. The third finding is that the Army Corps does recognize that disparity exists. And to the Corps' credit, they have made several significant policy changes to address this issue, two of which we will review. First, in an attempt to rectify racial and income disparities, the Army Corps has instituted a pilot program to eliminate local cost share requirements for project feasibility studies, which would help low-wealth frontline communities like those in Centerville. And second, the Army Corps has internally mandated that social and environmental impacts, the use of nature-based infrastructure, and the impacts of climate change must be considered within their cost-benefit analyses. And both of these present opportunities for the NAACP to push for pilot program consideration in eligible Black communities and to advocate for the expansion of this program, as well as to hold the Corps accountable for implementing this new policy directive. Now we will review the recommendations being presented to our client later this month and also discuss how the NAACP plans to incorporate these findings and recommendations into their existing advocacy strategies and frameworks. Building off the existing strong relationships with local chapters, we recommend that the national office acts as a central hub for notifying local chapters about public comment periods, identifying potential partners for coalition building and cost sharing, and serve as an educational resource for understanding Army Corps planning processes. The NAACP also has the opportunity to play an important role in holding federal officials accountable to ensure that social and environmental considerations become central to project approval and that these factors are being incorporated within the Corps' cost-benefit analysis. Finally, we recommend that local chapters advocate for expanded and more equitable flood infrastructure by approaching elected officials, congresspeople, senators, and local Army Corps staff, as well as through public pressure tactics such as social media campaigns, writing op-eds, and overwhelming public comment periods. A second recommendation is to use investigative research and legal tactics, such as submitting Freedom of Information Act requests, like we saw with Bayou City Waterkeeper, as well as using lawsuits to push for more transparency and to challenge undesirable projects. We are living in a historic moment for racial justice in the United States. Army Corps policy reforms and the Biden-Harris administration represent a pivotal opportunity for the NAACP to hold policymakers accountable in advancing the needs of Black and low-wealth communities across the country and bring to fruition a nation that focuses not on achieving the greatest economic return, but instead on prioritizing, strengthening, and empowering frontline communities and collectively building a more resilient and just United States. And as a closing thought for us to linger on, I would like to quote from Amanda Gorman's powerful and inspiring inaugural poem, The Hill We Climb. For there is always light, if only we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it. And I would like to say thank you and open up the floor for questions.
Okay, do we have any questions? Stephanie will recognize you if we have.
You guys can raise your digital Zoom hands or type it in the chat. All right, so we have a question from Daria. Daria, are you able to unmute yourself or do you want to type it in the chat?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Hi. Yeah, so I heard a lot the Army Corps mentioned, but I didn't hear Congress mentioned once, or really any recommendations on what local governments can do or state governments. And I work for the Army Corps of Engineers, but I'm not here representing them today. I'm here because I'm a Columbia SEPA grad. And I think like your recommendations are missing and misunderstanding how the Corps functions on a fundamental level that undermines their effectiveness. The Corps cost shares are part of the authorization for us to participate in any action, in any study, or in any construction or recommendation. And the Corps doesn't have leeway to change those without congressional authority. And similarly, the way that we recommend and the way that we authorize projects not only needs the support of the non-federal sponsors, but Congress as well. And so there really needs to be a multifaceted discussion and approach that acknowledges the Corps' limitations, both in terms of what we are allowed to look at and what we're paid to look at, because we charge our time in 15-minute increments to projects. And so like Congress keeps a pretty hard fist on what we can do, and we don't set our own policies. So saying like that, you know,
Sorry, thank you for your comment and question. Let's let the group respond. I think we got the point. Go ahead, Kelly.
Thank you for questions and comments, Daria. So we do recognize, and through our project, and we did learn that Congress and the Office of Management and Budget do have a large part in this process as well. For this project with the NAACP and for what we presented this morning, we are focusing on where the NAACP can apply pressure and advocate within the Army Corps. But in our larger recommendations to the NAACP, we did include advocacy recommendations in Washington to address those challenges that exist within Congress and the Office of Management and Budget that do also present barriers for communities to have projects approved in their communities.
Do you also have a recommendation for local governments to institute zoning practices that keep disadvantaged communities out of the floodplain?
No, we didn't address that directly within our recommendations to the NAACP, but again, we do acknowledge that we do acknowledge that this project, or excuse me, that flood vulnerability and flood exposure exists within multiple layers of government, not just at the federal level, but also, yes, absolutely at the local level in terms of zoning practices and policies. But we did not address that directly within the scope of this project.
Let's move to Elizabeth's question. We only have a little bit more time for this group. Elizabeth, go ahead. Unmute yourself.
Sure. Thanks so much for that really interesting presentation, Colleen. You touched on this a little bit, your use of data and mapping, and I was just really interested in what that process was, and I'm sure that was really kind of a challenging thing to take on. So I'd just love to hear a little more about what was involved there.
Colleen, you're on mute.
Oh, thank you for that question, Liz. So we selected 3 case study areas: St. Louis, Missouri, Indianapolis, as well as New Orleans. And like you indicated, we did mapping exercises. We mapped socioeconomic variables such as property value, race, income, poverty level in relationship to flood exposure. And we were looking to see where there were relationships between exposure and things such as, again, race, property value, income. It was a fun exercise, but yes, as you indicated, it was challenging, especially data collection and analyzing that data, and ultimately aligning that data with the literature and having those complement each other versus only having literature to support our research or only having data. We had to merge the two. Thanks, Liz.
Do we have time for one more question for this group? Do we have any?
No more questions.
Okay, well, Colleen, thank you, and thank you to the group. Very nice job. Why don't we move directly into our second briefing, which is it's going to be Elizabeth Wilson, who is working with Professor Jossam and her team on the power of nature in Ecuador. So if we're ready for that, let's begin.
Yes, thank you. Hi everyone, I'm Elizabeth Wilson, and I'm going to be presenting today about our project, The Power of Nature, Accelerating Carbon Pricing Policies and Legal Framework for Ecuador, which we've been working on for Conservation International. And before we begin, I'd love to say a huge thank you to our whole workshop group for all their really hard work as well as Professor Jossam for her guidance throughout the project, and of course to Carolina Rosero and Montserrat Alban, our client contacts. So this beautiful landscape that you see here is part of the Achuar Nationalities territory in Southeast Ecuador, sometimes described as Alfombra Verde con Rios, or a carpet of green with rivers. And the Achuar nationalities inhabit an area that is over 90% forest, which is a precious but dwindling resource in Ecuador. The Sociobosque program provides the Achuar people and other indigenous groups with direct payments in return for protecting the forest they inhabit. And this allows them to have some breathing room to withstand financial challenges without resorting to harvesting trees on their land. However, due to funding cuts in the Ecuadorian government, the future of this program and others like it may be in jeopardy. So today, I'm going to help you understand our efforts to support the Sociobosque program through this project. I'll start with a brief overview of the client and project goals, then I'll describe the methodology we use for our analysis before sharing our results and our recommended approaches. Our client for this project is Conservation International, a nonprofit environmental organization working towards empowering societies to responsibly and sustainably care for nature, our global biodiversity, and the well-being of humanity. Our team has been working to help identify potential solutions to deforestation through carbon pricing mechanisms that we can share with decision makers and government representatives. And our focus is to find a way to leverage money from the private sector to sustainably fund conservation initiatives, primarily the Sociobosque program, that promote equity and work directly with indigenous forest communities. The Sociobosque program is an initiative of the government of Ecuador and was developed with the help of Conservation International, and it provides economic incentives to indigenous and rural communities that voluntarily commit to conserve their native forests. And it has a nationwide participation by indigenous and farmer communities, including the Achuar nationality that we saw just before. And this Sociobosque program is part of a larger movement in Ecuador for increasing indigenous inclusion in government and development. And in 2008, the Constitution of Ecuador was amended to include greater focus on indigenous rights. And this included a recognition of the rights of nature within the Constitution. And it also included articles that prohibit the appropriation of natural or ecosystem services. A consequence of this is that any regulation of carbon dioxide through a market is unconstitutional, as it is seen as allowing for the appropriation of the absorption of carbon dioxide by Ecuador's forests. So in order to approach this project within these parameters, our methodology involved focusing our scope on 3 different models. These 3 models included 2 that are based on case studies of successful programs elsewhere, so a carbon tax and offset program in Colombia and a cap and trade program in California. And we also included a 3rd model focusing on the Ecuadorian carbon neutrality certification program. Our research included literature reviews, extensive interviews, and a quantitative financial analysis. And for each model, we considered what barriers exist to implementing a similar program in Ecuador and what sort of revenue might be generated from the initiative, as well as what the political and social outcomes would be, especially with regard to equity and indigenous rights. And once our analysis was conducted, we distilled our findings into 2 distinct approaches for Ecuador. One is based on the current political situation and constitution, and one is for if a window for change were to open. So Ecuador is currently in the run-up to a presidential election, so the political situation is quite uncertain for the future. And we wanted to make sure our client is prepared to make recommendations right now, and also prepared in the event that a policy window for constitutional change opens, that they can jump in and present some options then too. So as I said, our first option is based on a study of the system used in Colombia. And they use an emissions tax and offset system where polluters pay a tax on the amount of greenhouse gases they emit, or they can buy offsets to reduce their net emissions and reduce the amount of tax they pay. And while this has been successful in Colombia, we considered what the impacts would be if a similar system was implemented in Ecuador. And we projected that it could produce around $100 million of revenue for the government in the first year of operation, which is more than enough to support the Socio-Bosque program and other initiatives. However, there are several issues with this model, and these include political feasibility, as it's not currently politically possible. Also, the potentially regressive nature of carbon taxes, and crucially, that the offset part of this model violates the Constitution, as we saw earlier. The second model we considered is based on a case study of California's cap and trade system. And in this sort of system, you set a maximum amount of emissions, or a cap, and then you auction allowances to companies who want to emit pollution. And they can only emit as much as they have the allowances for that they've either purchased through the initial auction or traded between themselves. And this has been implemented in California for several years now. And we estimate that if applied to Ecuador, this sort of system could generate approximately $23 million for the government in the first year. Now, this is significantly less than the carbon tax and offset system we just saw, but it would still mostly cover the Socio-Bosque program's annual costs. However, it faces similar challenges to the Colombia system, as it's currently not politically viable, and this sort of system can have larger effects on lower income households, and crucially, it violates that nature's rights part of the Constitution that we discussed. So in the third model, we considered the carbon neutrality certification, which is a program that has been in development for a while in Ecuador, but it hasn't yet come to fruition. And in this program, it provides a green certification for companies that measure, reduce, and offset their emissions. It is politically feasible, as it's currently being developed by the Ministry of Environment, and they have suggested it will be operational within 100 days. Crucially, it is allowed under the Constitution as well, so we get past that issue. However, it's really unclear how much revenue could be generated and whether or not this could even be a sustainable source of funding for the Socio-Bosque program. So to summarize the results over these three models, the main barrier we found was whether or not mechanisms are actually constitutionally allowed. And neither the carbon tax and offset nor the cap and trade is currently allowable under Ecuador's constitution, but the carbon neutrality certification is allowed. However, the main purpose for this analysis was figuring out how to generate revenue for conservation initiatives like the Socio-Bosque program. So the carbon tax and offset model would definitely provide more than enough revenue, and the cap and trade model should provide a significant amount of revenue. But with the carbon neutrality certification, it's really uncertain how much revenue could be generated. So given these results, we presented two separate recommended approaches. First, if the current constitution remains and the political situation remains as it is now, we have to respect the limitations on carbon pricing that it sets. Therefore, we recommend pursuing alternatives like this carbon neutrality certification. And to help its success, we recommend convening a working group on improving incentives with the Ministry of Environment and continuing to pursue international investment through other mechanisms. If a policy window were to open and it was possible to begin some constitutional change, we recommend either a carbon tax and offset or a cap and trade style system, as well as any other carbon crediting mechanisms that are available. And we'd have to be really mindful of the design of these systems, as equity and Indigenous rights can suffer as unintended consequences. So what does all this mean for the Achuar people and the future of the Socio-Bosque program? Is it even possible to secure sustainable funding given these limits? Well, the Constitution is not set in stone in Ecuador. It changed in 2008, and it can change again. It's much easier to get change than it is in the United States. And we have lots of reasons to be hopeful. There are so many international organizations that really want to invest in programs like these. And there's also a growing recognition that the best way to do conservation is to empower the Indigenous people. People like the Achuar nationality, who will continue to protect Ecuador's forests for the future. And as one member of the community said, people used to destroy our forests for pastures. Now we are planting trees near our homes. We are giving our children something that they will take care of, that will be planted for their future. So thank you so much for listening today, and I would be happy to take any questions now.
Thank you. Questions?
You guys can again raise your digital Zoom hands or let us know in the chat if you have any questions. All right, Emily has a question.
Hi, Liz. Great presentation. You presented 3 potential models. Can you talk about how you landed on those 3 and whether there were others you considered?
Yeah, great question. So obviously there's many more models that we could have looked at, but that are between, you know, these national carbon tax or cap and trade systems and this carbon neutrality certification program. But obviously we had to narrow, you know, focus our analysis somehow. And so in this third model, although I focused on the carbon neutrality certification program in this presentation, in our analysis and what we're presenting to the client, we do explore you know, several other options that are out there and are already in existence. So other types of carbon crediting. There's a forest finance accelerator called Emergent that we've been looking into as well. And then in terms of the case studies themselves, we knew we wanted to look at Colombia because the client had expressed interest in their system, and given that the countries share some similarities, it seemed like a good approach. And then we originally wanted to, for the cap and trade program, look at a new program that's being implemented in Acre, Brazil. But unfortunately, that program is just so new, they don't have any data yet, and it was just not possible to make any meaningful analysis, even though if we had that data, it would be perhaps more readily applicable to Ecuador than the California model we used, which ultimately we used because of the availability of data and just the fact that it's been around for long enough for us to be able to look at the effects and draw some conclusions.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? Okay.
That was the last one.
Do we have any others? No? Okay. Elizabeth, thank you. And thank you to the group. Very nice work. Why don't we do one more before we take a break? So let's move on to Professor Rosen's group and Haley Herzog on what financial and economic incentives exist for restoration in the United States. So we'll do this third one, and then we'll take a 5-minute break afterwards.
Okay. Let's see if this is going to work. Okay, there we go. Oops. Hello, everyone. I'm Haley Herzog, and today I will be presenting on behalf of my group on our capstone project developed with our client, the World Resources Institute, that explores financial incentives for land restoration in the United States. Today, I will highlight background on the problem of land degradation, followed by an overview of land restoration. Then I will introduce our project, including our client, WRI. I will also discuss our methodology, and finally, I will highlight key findings from our project. Land degradation is the loss of land productivity due to human-induced processes such as agriculture, deforestation, and climate change. And the consequences of these activities include habitat loss, soil erosion, wildfires, reduced carbon storage capacity, and many others. Together, these forces cause loss of biodiversity, increased ecological risk, and general loss of ecosystem services. This is a massive problem affecting 75% of global land area. And as a result, land degradation is becoming more expensive than ever before, costing billions of dollars every year. Land restoration solves the expensive problem of degradation by making degraded ecosystems healthier and more ecologically productive. Some of the key nature-based solutions for land restoration include agroforestry, regenerative agriculture, reforestation, and wetland management. On this slide here, on the left, you see a degraded ecosystem. The natural balance has been depleted due to unsustainable land practices leading to erosion and lack of vegetation. On the right side, however, you see how restoration can solve the challenges of degradation. This is the same creek shown 6 years after restoration began. A typical landowner wants to make as much profit off their land as possible, but this can lead to decisions that overwork the land and throw off the natural balance, as is the case in the before picture. To incentivize the landowner to instead implement long-term sustainable practices that restore the natural equilibrium and lead to the after picture, there needs to be a financial motivation to cover the costs. Our client for this project, the World Resources Institute, is a global think tank who broadly works to protect the Earth's ability to provide for people. And WRI requested we examine financial and economic incentives for land restoration in the US. We are specifically working with WRI's Global Restoration Initiative. The Global Restoration Initiative aims to accelerate the movement to restore degraded lands around the globe. Prior projects have examined restoration policies in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. But our project now marks the beginning of this initiative's research into the US in order to explore restoration legislation from a wealthy nation. WRI requested that we provide a synthesis of policies with incentives for landscape restoration, and they will use these policies as an input to develop an English language policy identification framework. This framework will allow WRI to search and identify relevant restoration incentives, and ultimately it will be scaled and adapted for use in other countries. To provide WRI with the basis for this work, this semester we built a database of relevant US policies, designed a framework to organize the policies based on keywords, and conducted an analysis across 3 US states to highlight restoration incentives across the US. To research and analyze restoration policies, our methodology began with a literature review of relevant policies and programs at the state and federal levels. And then we conducted interviews with subject matter experts and built our policy analysis, the framework for our policy analysis. Based on our research and WRI's interests, we refined the scope of our project to focus on policies incentivizing private landowners in California, Maryland, and Colorado. We focused on these states because our research indicated that they all have successful restoration policies in place, but different geographies and representative of different US regions and different ownership patterns, allowing us to compare them. Using Maryland as an example, I will further explain why we chose this research scope and explain our analysis process. We focused our research on non-government owned private lands because the majority of US land is privately owned, and our research highlighted that explicit and identifiable incentives for restoration are directed toward private lands. And also because WRI requested we highlight innovative policies which focused on private incentives and markets. For example, in Maryland, 87% of land is privately owned, and Maryland's nutrient trading program is a market-based policy that has been recognized for its innovative approach. This program works by providing farmers with credits to implement conservation efforts that lead to restoration beyond a baseline requirement. The farmers can then sell their credits to other entities that need them. For each state, we identified 20 policies that similarly incentivize restoration across different rural land covers and in response to multiple degradation threats. For example, again, in Maryland, policies that incentivize wetland restoration were particularly relevant because Maryland is home to the Chesapeake Bay, which is the largest estuary system in the United States. Within the 20 policies, we identified federal level policies, including multiple policies that affect all 3 states, such as initiatives authorized by the Farm Bills, including the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, which incentivizes agricultural producers to improve ecosystem and land quality through cost sharing and technical assistance. And we also identified state level policies, such as Maryland's nutrient trading program. Based on our policy analysis, we found the most common incentives to be first, technical assistance, second, government grants, and third, cost sharing. And I will now explain each of these incentives with an example of a policy we identified that uses that incentive. Technical assistance is a non-financial assistance, but still saves the targeted entity resources by providing skills, knowledge, or physical tools that they would otherwise have to purchase to conduct restoration activities. For example, technical assistance is used in the California Forest Improvement Program, which was enacted in 1978 to address the enormous and urgent threat of wildfires. Through this program, the California state government provides the preparation of a forest management plan and aid and supervision for forest thinning and other reforestation activities. Additionally, we found that technical assistance is often used in policies in coordination with another more explicit financial incentive, and this program also uses cost sharing, which I will define in a moment. Government grants are a form of direct financial assistance from the government to broadly fund the costs of restoration. Grants are used by the Great Outdoors Colorado program, which was authorized in 1992 and uses proceeds from the Colorado State Lottery to fund broad restoration work across the state. Eligible entities apply for grants on behalf of private landowners who then use the money to fund restoration projects. Cost sharing is another form of direct financial assistance, but typically does not cover 100% of costs, leaving the landowner then responsible for a portion of those costs. For example, cost sharing is used in Maryland's Agricultural Water Quality Cost Share Program. Before this program was enacted in 1982, farmland management practices led to soil erosion, unbalanced soil nutrients, and threatened local water. Now, however, this program incentivizes farmers to restore their land by covering 87.5% of associated costs. In terms of how WRI will use our findings from this project, first, the Global Restoration Initiative will use our findings to validate their policy identification framework, allowing it to be applied to other countries to recognize restoration policies. And second, the policy analysis database we built can be used by WRI as they build on our work and analyze policies after this project. And third, our policy database showcases the variety of restoration incentives prevalent in the US, and these incentives can be potentially scaled for additional restoration work. Our main findings from this project are that technical assistance, government grants, and cost sharing are common mechanisms to incentivize private landowners in rural settings to implement land restoration measures. However, further research is needed to understand the entire picture of US restoration policies and the effectiveness of these incentives. Considering this, our recommendations for the next steps WRI can take to build upon our findings are to first expand the analysis to more states to determine whether the pattern of incentives remains consistent. Second, they can extend the scope of analysis to include disincentives and perverse incentives for land restoration. And lastly, we recommend including other political and economic factors, particularly the incentives that exist for other landowners, including public and tribal landowners. In conclusion, these incentives we've identified can be potentially scaled or replicated and studied in depth to monitor policy outcomes and successes and to amplify sustainable land practices. With that, I'd like to thank everyone for listening today and now ask if there are any questions.
Okay, thank you. Questions? Maya has one.
Yeah. Hi, Haley. Great job. I was just wondering what other incentives you guys explored for this project.
We did look at a number of other incentives. Some of the common ones that we looked at were subsidies from the government or tax deductions too, which are often used with policies that implement conservation easements. So then if the landowner implements a conservation easement, then they can go back and get a tax deduction, which incentivizes them to like set aside that land that they otherwise would be using or profiting off of. There's also credits like I briefly discussed in the Maryland Nutrient Trading Program. Fines are somewhat less common in the policies we looked at, but definitely still used. Supplies too, there's a number that we looked at, but far and away, technical assistance, grants, and cost sharing were the most common.
Okay, Rachel?
Hi, Haley. Thank you for that presentation. I was wondering if you found any distinctions between the three main states that you looked at in terms of which incentive, if some incentives were more common in some states or if some incentives seem to work better in some states than others.
So we did see a slight difference. In all three states, the three incentives, grants, technical assistance, and cost sharing were most common. In Colorado and California, it was the same order as overall. So first technical assistance, then grants, then cost sharing. In Maryland, I believe grants were most common and then technical assistance. We did not look into a reason for this or the effectiveness. It would be interesting, definitely in the future, to examine that, but our project did not include that scope, but thank you.
Thank you, Haley. Other questions? Okay, if we have none, then we'll thank Haley and the group. Congratulations, good job. And it's now 9:44, so let's reconvene at 9:50, okay? And we'll start with our next. Okay, why don't we resume? We're now going to turn to the project that was advised by Professor Hill. And we have Sarah Braverman, who's going to speak about a federal policy to manage refrigerant banks. So take it away.
Thank you, Professor Cohen. Good morning, everyone. My name is Sarah Braverman. This past semester, my team has been working with the Natural Resources Defense Council to develop recommendations for the better management of hydrofluorocarbon refrigerant banks. I'll begin this presentation with a brief background on hydrofluorocarbons, which are commonly known as HFCs. I will lead into an overview of our project where I will introduce our client. I will then go over the scope of our research and the findings from our case studies. Towards the end of this presentation, I will discuss the policy recommendations we believe are necessary to reduce HFC emissions. Hydrofluorocarbons, known as HFCs, are a class of man-made fluorinated gases. They are primarily used in refrigeration and air conditioning, but they're also used in fire suppressants and aerosols. HFCs were first used as an alternative refrigerant to the ozone-depleting chlorofluorocarbons, commonly known as CFCs. The successful implementation of the Montreal Protocol in 1988 led to the phasing out of CFCs around the world. While HFCs do not deplete the ozone, they are still a very potent greenhouse gas. While their potency is measured by their global warming potential, which is commonly referred to as GWP, this is basically a calculation of how powerful a greenhouse gas is compared to carbon dioxide. To give you an idea of how potent HFCs are, if CO2 has a GWP of 1, HFCs can have a GWP of up to 15,000. Not only that, but HFCs can exist in the atmosphere for up to 260 years. HFCs are released into the atmosphere during their use, maintenance, and transport. This leakage happens largely unintentionally. It's usually due to leaky equipment or just the lack of proper management. The average grocery store leaks 25% of its HFCs each year. Air conditioners and refrigeration systems are responsible for 86% of all HFC emissions in the United States. Almost a third of that comes from commercial refrigeration, which refers to air conditioners, refrigerators, and freezers used in businesses of all sizes. Without proper management of HFC emissions will increase global warming by 0.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. If we are to meet the Paris Climate Agreement's goal of limiting warming by less than 2 degrees Celsius, reducing HFC emissions will be essential. In December of 2020, Congress passed with bipartisan support the American Innovation and Manufacturing Act, commonly known as the AIM Act. The passing of this bill was one of the most significant political actions the US has taken to combat climate change, as it calls for the phase down of HFC production and use by 85% over the next 15 years. So what would this look like? A reduction on this scale would equate to reducing the emissions of nearly 195 million cars every single year. Our client, the Natural Resources Defense Council, is one of the leading environmental nonprofits in the United States. They have been advocating for the proper HFC management and the phase out of these chemicals for over 30 years. The NRDC asked our team to develop a set of policy recommendations for the management of the HFC refrigerant bank, which refers to the quantity of HFCs currently in use. Over the past 3 months, our team has researched current end-of-life management practices of HFCs. This includes their recycling, reclamation, and destruction. We looked at the management programs and policies in the EU, Japan, and Australia, as these regions have some of the strongest HFC management practices in the world. Within the US, we also looked at similar programs in California and Washington State. In addition to a literature review of HFC management programs, we also conducted interviews with regulatory and market experts in the HFC industry. We would like to note a couple of challenges we encountered while conducting our research. In some of the regions that we looked at, the data on HFC phase down programs was not made publicly available by the regulatory agencies of that region. In other cases, the phase down programs were still too new to even offer significant data for our project. We approached our analysis conservatively with these limitations in mind. Our analysis of these studies helped us identify 4 effective mechanisms that have been implemented in the US, the EU, Japan, and Australia. The first mechanism is supply chain accountability. Refrigerant chemical producers hold a significant amount of power over the supply chain. Cradle to grave responsibility will incentivize producers to make better HFC management decisions. The second mechanism is leakage monitoring and reporting. Japan and the EU have relatively comprehensive registration, record keeping, and reporting. And as a result, they have some of the most stringent regulations on refrigerant leakage. These regulations led to an increase in HFC reclamation following the implementation of these measures. The third widely used mechanism is to set bans or restrictions on the production or import of certain HFCs with high global warming potentials. This approach was widely effective in many of the countries that we surveyed. The last mechanism is to provide proper certification for people working within the industry. Effective HFC management policies set requirements for operators at every level of the value chain, which included mandating certifications set and administered by the government. Our research unearthed quite a few different policy mechanisms for managing HFCs. I will review a handful of these mechanisms and the role they play in reducing HFCs emissions throughout the life cycle of these chemicals. We believe these management practices merit consideration from the EPA and other regulators because of their feasibility and efficacy in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. To begin with, we recommend that the EPA establish extended producer responsibility, meaning that HFC producers are ultimately responsible for ensuring that the HFCs they produce are properly destroyed or reclaimed at the end of their life. Extended producer responsibility relies on being able to track the products of these producers. Therefore, the EPA should also implement a comprehensive tracking system for all HFCs used within the United States. This brings us to the second step in the HFC life cycle, the equipment manufacturers. We recommend that the EPA require HFC equipment manufacturers to use reclaimed or recycled chemicals in all new equipment. This requirement should also be extended to equipment operators and servicers, requiring them to only use reclaimed or recycled chemicals when restocking refrigerant systems. We also recommend that the EPA sponsor educational messaging and training programs for equipment operators and servicers, and expand on the existing certification requirements that are already in place. We've designed this circular management approach based on successful HFC management practices from around the world. By enforcing these management practices at each stage of the HFC life cycle, the EPA can maximize their efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. One of the most significant things we can do to mitigate climate change is to reduce the emission of HFCs into the atmosphere. They contribute to climate change on a much greater scale than carbon dioxide. HFC emissions are largely preventable, which is why their management is so important. We would like to thank Christina Teodoridi and Alex Hilbrand of the NRDC for giving us and SEPA the opportunity to research and design policy recommendations for addressing the existential threat of climate change. And by us, I mean the outstanding members of our team, Allison Day, Carol Hugh, Rachel Grace Patton, Andrew Solfest, Rachel Goodgall, Tim Woodruff, Alina Yurova, and my co-manager, Charlie Sad. Finally, I would like to thank Professor Adrienne Hill for her exceptional advice and guidance throughout this project. Thank you for listening. I will now take time for questions.
Good, very nice. Good job, Sarah. Questions, comments? Okay, Jenny.
Great job, Sarah. I was wondering if you could elaborate more on the implications or how you think the Biden-Harris administration will actually start to implement, regulating HFCs, and like the timeline and how much cooperation. It sounds like there will be a lot of cooperation with the industries. But yeah, like what are the next steps for actually implementing this?
Yeah, thank you for your question, Jenny. Well, the recent passing of the AIM Act was really a big push for managing HFCs on a national level. So we can see that, and that has a 15-year timeline for reducing HFCs. So we expect that, and the reason for that large timeline is to prevent any kind of price shocks as we start to phase out the use of HFCs and start to use alternatives on a much greater scale. Alternatives such as ammonia or carbon dioxide, actually. And there have been a lot of, like we mentioned earlier, there are some excellent state policies in California and in Washington state that have been pretty successful at reducing the demand for HFCs, and particularly those of high global warming potentials. And yeah, we expect to see a lot of collaboration. We spoke with people all across the industry, both on the policy side and on the manufacturing side, and everyone is in quite supportive ending the use of these very, very potent greenhouse gases.
Okay, other questions? Do you see any, Stephanie? Nope.
I don't see any more questions.
Okay, Sarah, thank you, and thank you to the group. Very nice job. And we'll turn to our final briefing on climate change, resilience through agricultural water reuse. I guess Michael Bannon will be speaking on behalf of Professor Degnan's group.
Awesome. Okay. Hello, I am Michael Bannon and I represent the Hudson Valley Water Reuse Team. I'd like to thank my team members, our manager, Dana Krieger, and Deputy Manager, Catherine Lynn, along with our faculty advisor, Nancy Degnan, and our client, Carrie Capuco, the Director of Strategic Operations for the Water Reuse Association, for their help and contributions towards our project. For our agenda this morning, I'll highlight the importance of water and define water reuse and introduce our client, the Water Reuse Association. Following this, I'll review our project objectives and provide some background about the Hudson River Valley region and why our client asked us to focus there. Then I'll discuss our research approaches and conclude with our findings and recommendations. So to begin, as many of you know, water is everything. It is critical to our nation's health, strength, security, and resilience. But the solutions available to manage water and its availability are often very complex. Climate change and climate variability pose increasing risks for water security. Water reuse can be a valuable tool in achieving and sustaining that security. But what exactly does the term water reuse mean? Actually, we found that defining the term was crucial in our project to encompass the fullest scope of water reuse. And as you can see in this graph, water reuse, also known as water recycling, is the process of intentionally capturing wastewater, stormwater, saltwater, gray water, and cleaning it as needed for a designated beneficial water reuse, such as irrigation, drinking, groundwater recharge, or watershed restoration. Our client, the Water Reuse Association, is the only trade association focused on advancing laws, policy, and funding to increase water reuse. The association's members include utilities, businesses, government agencies, and non-for-profits in 38 US states and 11 countries. In the US, the association's projects are dedicated to increasing water resilience in water-stressed areas, such as California, Florida, and Arizona, but there are obvious challenges in meeting the human and ecological demand for fresh water. To broaden their impact, the association asked us to explore water reuse in the water-rich area of the Hudson River Valley. The reason? Climate change and variability likely pose risks for water-abundant areas. This is where water isn't looked at as a disappearing source, but may become less dependable, specifically for farmers and wineries, in a future with a more variable climate. The association would like us to get out ahead of these risks and help mitigate them through water reuse policies and practices. Our team's final output and project consist of a report and recommendations for water reuse in the food and wine production sectors of the Valley. These sectors are important in economic and environmental terms to support the association's efforts to advance legislation in New York, as well as water reuse in abundant areas throughout the country. We can now take a look at some background on the Hudson River Valley for some important context. The valley is a rich agricultural region with around 3,500 farms, ranging from dairy to fruit orchards, and covering over 500,000 acres. There are 35 vineyards of varying size, so the valley is considered also a large wine producing region, and the farms and vineyards are typically family owned and multi-generational. The overall economic impact of this part of New York is approximately $42 billion each year. And in addition to the 10 counties shown on the map, New York City also depends on the Valley region and watershed to meet the water needs of approximately 8 to 14 million citizens on a daily basis. And although it's a water abundant region, it is expected to face increased climate variability, such as patterns of heavy rainfall intertwined with drier periods, along with the potential impacts on water quality and temperature increases, and along with sea level rise that are occurring at faster rates than the global or even national average, leading to potential flooding around the Hudson River. Along with this, the droughts in the summer months can impact the growing seasons for food and wine production. And building stronger water reuse policies and practices in the Hudson River Valley is important for climate change resilience in both the near and long term, and is a crucial part of sustainability. In order to organize our approach to our research and in consultation with our client, we organize into 4 main pillars: policy, food and wine production, technology, and key actors. This framework helped guide our strategy for our research and analysis throughout the semester. So the secondary research team reviewed over 35 reports and articles, including an in-depth read of existing New York State government websites, water policies, and regulations. They also reviewed a variety of other sources such as case studies, local news, and websites. And the secondary research helped identify stakeholders within the region and informed the development of questions for our primary research. The primary research team, with the input from the secondary team and the client, identified stakeholders and experts for this project. Specifically, the team identified 51 stakeholders and experts, refined the list to 39 potential interviewees, and then conducted 15-hour-long semi-structured interviews guided by 10 key questions to gain a better understanding of water reuse for our client. Our next step was to probe the data and see if we could refine our findings to suggest some immediate recommendations for advancing water reuse in the Hudson River Valley. Our analytical team conducted a stakeholder analysis and a SWOT analysis. For our stakeholder analysis, this helped rank our stakeholders as champions or leaders for water reuse practices and legislation. Specifically, the regulators set requirements and controls for water reuse strategies and mainly consist of government agencies. The influencers educate on the topic of water reuse and were predominantly institutions and universities. The user and owners are willing to make capital investments in maintenance for water reuse and consisted of the farms and wineries within the region. And the implementers design, consult, or help with the installation of water reuse and were mainly made up of nonprofit and for-profit organizations. So now we can take a look at the SWOT analysis as well. In addition to the stakeholder analysis, the team conducted a SWOT analysis focused on the point of view from our client. The SWOT analysis identifies the strengths and weaknesses for the Water Reuse Association's perspective, and the threats and opportunities focused on the stakeholders' perspective associated with our 4 pillars of research. As we shared already, the strengths include the experience with designing water reuse regulation and convening effective partnerships. And some important weaknesses include little experience in policy and regulation for water abundant areas, accompanied by a limited network within the Hudson River Valley. Our findings from our research helped inform our threats and opportunities. Among the threats are a mixed understanding of water reuse definitions and applications, the necessity to build and maintain trust, underfunded mandates, and a lack of transparency on the cost of technology. But the opportunities are very exciting. The Hudson River Valley is a climate and sustainability motivated area, and existing stormwater and wastewater practices can inform water reuse. And along with this, there are a number of longstanding associations, research institutes, and community coalitions already working within the region, allowing for farm and wine production's sustainable practices that can be used for water reuse pilot programs. So based on our research and analysis of findings, we reorganized into 3 main pillars and integrated the key actors across these pillars. So let's turn to our recommendations. For our policy pillar, we recommend that our client first work with high priority regulators, such as the New York City Department of Environmental Protection and the US Department of Agriculture. First, to begin designing regulation and legislation for water reuse within the Hudson River Valley. Specifically, we suggest avoiding underfunded mandates and focusing on economic incentives and the benefits of sustainability. These will be potential options to target as sources of funding or grants for potential reuse projects. Along with this, our recommendation is to design and promote pilot programs for water reuse to demonstrate the potential economic and sustainability benefits for water reuse throughout the Hudson Valley. For the food and wine pillar, our recommendation focuses on the influencers, owners, and users identified within the stakeholder analysis, such as Grassroots Farm and Cornell Cooperative Extension. We recommend that the association partner to customize education and outreach for the Hudson River Valley, particularly given reuse as a leverage against climate variability. Second, to design and deliver that education through and with longstanding community members to build relationships, maximize trust levels, and define the mutual benefits. And finally, work with farmers to gain a better understanding of existing technology for storm and wastewater management to inform water reuse and determine the scope and scale of water reuse within the Hudson River Valley. And finally, for our technology pillar, the implementers and influencers identified within the stakeholder analysis were the Columbia Water Center and the Watershed Agricultural Council. And we recommend that the association continue to engage with universities and research institutes to inform and even help identify appropriate technology for the water abundant region of the Hudson River Valley. Second, develop a survey to better understand the potential costs with technology and the incentives for investing in water reuse technology tied to the risks associated with climate variability. And finally, to integrate findings on technology with the policy and regulation design to ensure more effective practices, return on investments, and more customized education and outreach. In summary, we hope that our recommendations result in greater farmer and community engagement, along with increased stakeholder engagement and reuse practices. In doing so, the Hudson River Valley can experience increased water security and climate resilience, helping to ensure human and ecological well-being now and for the future. Thank you so much, and I look forward to taking any questions at this time.
Thank you. Very nice work. I see Celeste has a question for you.
Hi, Michael. Great presentation. I have a question for your team. How politically feasible do you think water reuse is in the region?
Yes. So for this report and recommendations, this was very novel and exploratory research because the Reuse Association has not looked in a water abundant region. So we found that the interest is there, but since this is a novel research and the legislation is not there yet, with time, hopefully the engagement is there. So with time, it seems politically feasible.
Okay, other questions?
Cecilia?
Hi, Michael. Great presentation. This is more of a general question. Were there any other potential opportunities that you weren't able to look into and explore with your team, given the time constraint that you'd like to talk about?
Yes. So there were two sectors that we weren't able to look into, but were able to dive into a little bit, but would be great for further research. And that was specifically water reuse potentials within restaurants and the water reuse potentials within golf courses within the region. Along with this, we were able to find one case study specifically on equine farms using water reuse. So there were a couple different areas that we were looking at, but weren't able to dive completely into. Thank you.
Okay, Elizabeth.
Hi, Michael, really interesting presentation. And I was just wondering if what the main differences are when you're looking at a water-rich region like this compared to a water-scarce region, like somewhere in California, for example, and whether it's all the same approaches and policy approaches, or whether it's a completely different sort of approach and tactics.
Awesome. Yes. Thank you so much. I feel like one of the main differences that we looked at when figuring out the aspect of the exploratory research was this aspect of, is the engagement there? Because this isn't necessarily needed currently. So it was more of figuring out climate variability, specifically like each different aspects of climate variability within the region really factored in, such as the rainfall and the heavy droughts affecting the growing periods. In other not water abundant states, they are already dealing with this and having to deal with it real time, while this allowed us to kind of look at all the different options and see what could be the best technology, what could be the best financial and each different aspect, so that the actual organizations and farms and wineries would be able to figure out what's best for them for the future. Thank you so much.
Okay, do we have any other questions?
No other questions.
Okay, well, thank you. And let me thank all of the groups and faculty and all of the guests who were here today. This is a terrific set of projects, wonderful briefings. And as I said earlier, really the culmination of one of the most complicated and novel years the program has had from 2002 till today. Every year we've had these presentations of client projects, and this group did a spectacular job under what is without question the most difficult circumstances we've had. So I can congratulate you for doing that. This is a group that has been working very diligently through these technologies. Unfortunately, have never had the experience of being together face to face as a group. We will do that when this pandemic's over, I guarantee it. I hope you can all come in for the weekend that we will have a celebration and maybe even some substantive discussion as well about our field. We are in an interesting time period, as everybody knows, with a new administration in Washington, and with, I think, the real opportunity for progress on so many of the issues that are so important to us. So again, first, I want to thank everybody for the work and really the incredible effort over this year. This is the last time we'll be gathering as a group like this, except for commencement activities, but this is our last substantive discussion. And I have to say that you've done a really impressive job. And I think on behalf of the faculty that are here and the rest of the faculty as well, I want to congratulate you. And let's stay in touch as you hit the job market. I'm personally committed to helping every one of you, and I know the rest of the faculty and our alums will help as well. So let's not be shy about that. Let's put all of the things you've learned to work. The planet needs it, and the society needs it. So anyway, have a great rest of your morning, and congratulations. Take care, everybody.